All right, so I just got done pulling this first board. I pulled off of the all of the nuts that were holding the controls on. There's no screws holding the actual board in, so I was able to just pull that out. And now I'm doing a little visual inspection. We've got some odd, oxidation here that could just be dirt and spider webs and shit that just kind of grew onto the board after time. But I'm looking at the solder connections, so let's see if I can point out some issues here. I see a few solder joints that don't really look very happy. Let's go over to this puppy right here. Check this guy out. All right, let's see if we can focus on that. You see how you can actually see through the board? So that's a joint, and as I'm looking at it, I wish this would focus better. As I'm looking at it, the only place that it's really grabbed on is just a little bit on the left-hand side here. The right-hand side, I guess, if you were looking at the way that the controls are mounted. Looking at the other solder joints, there's a few here and there that could probably use some touch-up. There's that weird oxidation again. So I'll just wipe that off the board just to make sure that there aren't any problems with that part of the board. But yeah, there's a lot of cold solder joints on here. The ones that aren't shiny, that are all dull looking, those are cold solder joints. There's a couple of spots where there was pretty minimal solder, and I'm not going to glop the stuff on there, but I'm just going to hit that with an iron and make sure. Here's another one that's not really connected very well. And just go through here and just make sure that the board's good to go. So I'll use a really fine tip soldering iron, and little guys like this might benefit from a little bit more touch-up. But basically just melt the joints, make sure that they're good to go. There's a nasty looking one right there. There's one that's just kind of cracking up. Here's a bunch of nasty cold solders here mixed in. Here's a nasty guy that's going to need to be dealt with. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff. And mainly as I go through, I'm going to do a visual inspection of all of the resistors, and I'll check capacitance. I'll have to use an ESR meter, or I'll have to desolder some of these capacitors just to make sure that they're good to go. But I'll take a look as I'm going through the board. I'll pay special attention to the control pots and to these switches here, just to make sure that the actual casings of those are down pretty good. But as I'm doing a visual inspection, I'm not seeing any blown resistors, so everything looks pretty happy. But that's basically what I'm going to do. I'll start there, look for anything. Obviously I'll look at cracked capacitors. That's not a crack, that's just a blob on top. I'll look at these orange caps. These actually don't really have a visual cue when they're not providing any capacitance, so I might have to desolder these and double check them. Everything looks pretty good on this board, but this isn't necessarily the board I'm worried about. All the controls worked, and all these capacitors, nothing looks bulgy or anything like that. So it's really the other boards that have me more concerned, specifically that master board down there that has the tube sockets on it. So I just wanted to point out, and it's no fault of Marshall's necessarily, because they're making these in a pretty high volume. But this was one of the made in England models that was presumably, had a little bit more handmade love than the current made in Thailand or Vietnam or whatever that are going through a soldering bath. But maybe that's what they did with this one as well. Maybe it just went through a bath. Maybe the components weren't, fully seated the right way, and then maybe it just didn't, get all of that solder bath in all the right spots. So. Definitely something to look at when you're going through your board, just checking all of those solder joints to make sure that they're all actually, good, that they're sufficient, that they've got some good grab on the components. So this is sort of, step 2.5 here on the video. Step 2 obviously was pulling the board, but before I moved on to pulling the backboard, I just wanted to point out some of the things that I'm going to be doing as I visually inspect these boards.